So let's think about some key themes that we find in Bede's ecclesiastical history. One is this ideology around whether the British Christians uh, were really true, authentic, and good Christians. Part of the narrative that Bede presents is that British Christians are punished by the invasion of these pagan Saxons um, because the British didn't try to spread Christianity as well as they ought to have. And so the Saxons then are given the land of the British and the Christian faith instead of the British Christians flourishing with spreading the gospel. So we have a quote from the ecclesiastical history that illustrates this. In short, the fires kindled by the pagans proved to be God's just punishment on the sins of the nation. Just as the fires once kindled by the Chaldeans, as the Babylonians, destroyed the walls and buildings of Jerusalem. For as the just judge ordained, these heathen conquerors devastated the surrounding cities and countryside, extending the conflagration from the eastern to western shores. So this notion of punishment for sin, which is really coming out of what we call a Deuteronomistic reading of history, that if you're unfaithful, you'll be punished, and you might have some of your reward taken away from you and given to someone else instead. And so the great sin of the British or the Welsh was that they never properly preached the gospel to the Saxons. So there's another quote from the ecclesiastical history. But God, in his goodness, did not utterly abandon the people whom he had chosen, that's the Saxons, for he remembered them and sent this nation more worthy preachers of truth to bring them to the faith. That's the Romans as the more worthy preachers. And so there's really kind of, in a way, a mirroring of a supersessionist theology happening here, where the British are faithless and they are replaced by the Saxons who have greater faith. And the Church of Rome plays an important part in reigniting Christian faith in Britain, according to Bede's reading. But this really forces the question, when does Christianity begin in England? I've already given you hints that there's an earlier strand of Christianity here. Now, in 597, Augustine arrives in the Kingdom of Kent. He is a monk sent by Pope Gregory the Great from Rome. And he is received by King Ethelbert in the Kingdom of Kent, who is married to Bertha, who is a Frankish princess. Now, Kent is right across the English Channel from northwestern France. I have a picture on Populi of the chair of Pope Gregory the Great that is in the San Gregorio Monastery in Rome, and also of the ivory crozier that Gregory gave to Augustine to carry over with him as a sign of his episcopal authority. And so there's this tight linking then of a mission from Rome to an Anglo-Saxon kingdom. When Augustine arrives, he seems unaware of Western British Christians for probably a good 5 years, until about the year 602, when he begins to move outside of the Kingdom of Kent itself. So we're talking about a patchwork of various kingdoms in the British Isles, and of Rome trying to initiate a strategic relationship with some of those kingdoms. Now again, the Augustine we're talking about here is not the Augustine of Hippo. This is a person who lives several centuries later. There then is an encounter with two different forms of Christianity when Augustine and his crew arrive. One is this remnants of Romano-British Christianity. And evidence for this is in a variety of martyr shrines that still existed in older churches that are referenced by Augustine that Bede records. It looks like in these areas that Christianity was functioning more as a folk religion that laity engaged with, these martyr shrines as sites of holiness, this remembrance of the power of Christ, but no ecclesiastical structure in place, no clerical system in place, no clear catechism or instruction. And Bede presents these earlier forms of British Christianity as evidence that these Christians were prone to faithlessness. And as he says, these British Christians were, quote, ready to listen to anything novel and never hold firmly to anything. So a real dismissiveness of that kind of Christianity. And instead, we have also a kind of Frankish Christianity that the Queen Bertha, who's married to Ethelbert, has brought to the court in Kent, along with a bishop/confessor that's with her named Ludhard. And Bertha and her entourage, led by her bishop, worship at the Church of St. Martin outside the walls of Canterbury. St. Martin is a Frankish saint, not a British one. So Bertha looks like has brought over that devotion to him. What is really striking then is that Ethelbert receives baptism from the Roman representatives of Augustine of Hippo and not from the Frankish bishops. So Ethelbert could have been baptized way before by Ludhard, but he doesn't want to, because if he's baptized by Ludhard, Ethelbert comes under the control of the Frankish church and becomes in some ways dependent on them. But if he receives baptism from the center of the church in Rome, that gives him equal standing and prestige with the Franks and connects him to a symbol of imperial power. And so Bede's narrative of Augustine bringing Christianity to England is a little self-serving because Christianity is already there. The point is that England or the Anglo-Saxons come into the orbit of Roman Christianity instead of Frankish Christianity, British Christianity, or another option, Irish Christianity. So that's a key element I think we want to hold on to and reflect on as we talk more. A final significant theme then is around enculturation. Certainly what Augustine does is inject a lot of energy around Christianity in England. But as he is spreading the message of Christianity, Augustine runs into a lot of questions about how to apply Christian teachings in this context. And so we see this with a series of letters that Gregory writes, that Augustine writes to Gregory called the Libellus Responsium, which is the small book of answers, is what that would mean in Latin. And some of this regards episcopal jurisdiction. So now that we know that there are British bishops off to the west, and there's actually a Frankish bishop right there in Kent, Augustine has some questions. So I read to you here from Bede's Ecclesiastical History, a question he poses. What are to be our relations with the bishops of Gaul and Britain? And Pope Gregory responds in this way. We give you no authority over the bishops of Gaul, for since the time of my early predecessors, the Bishop of Arles has received the pallium, and his authority is to be in no way impaired. If therefore you have occasion to cross over to the province of Gaul, you are to consult with the Bishop of Arles on how to correct any faults among the bishops, and he should be remiss in administering discipline. Inspire him with your own zeal. And then he says, we've already written to the Bishop of Arles. So Arles was the center point of ecclesiastical jurisdiction in the Kingdom of Gaul. So note what he says is respect the jurisdiction of the Frankish bishops, but as you read the entirety of that response, he says nothing about respecting the authority of British bishops. And Gregory says specifically to Augustine, I've given you the pallium. And I have an image also on Populi of Augustine of Canterbury wearing the pallium, which is this center stripe of a single woven garment of wool that represents the authority of an archbishop, or what we call metropolitan authority, a bishop who oversees a whole other range of bishops. Now, in some ways, Gregory seems to not realize how actually well represented Western Britain is with bishops. These are well-educated bishops from the Irish sphere. And he is assuming that all of British Christianity is folk religion, and if there's any bishops out there related to them, they're all in error. And this is actually completely untrue. In a similar way, he has a question around purity laws and attendance in church, and this is a question further on page 82 of the reading from the Libellus Responsium. May an expectant mother be baptized? How soon after childbirth may she enter church? How soon after birth may a child be baptized, and if in danger of death? How soon after childbirth may a husband have relations with his wife? May a woman properly enter church at the time of menstruation? May she receive communion at these times? May a man enter church after relations with his wife before he is washed? Or receive the sacred mystery of communion? These uncouth English people require guidance in all these matters. Now, at first, these might strike you as really strange questions. They're especially strange questions if we assume the population is not Christian at all. The reason why is as you interrogate these questions, you realize they're actually coming out of a Christian reading of the holiness codes in the book of Leviticus, about how people can come near the holy and be in states of purity if they've had various bodily functions that suggest a disruption of the ordinary state of things. These practices of applying the holiness codes to Christian life were not British or English practices at all, but actually Frankish Christian practices. So what we're seeing is that there is a strand of Frankish Christianity operating in England here that Augustine of Canterbury has never encountered before and is trying to make sense of. And Gregory gives advice based on his Roman context, which is that these are not codes to be kept. And indeed argues throughout his response about not keeping these codes. Later on, though, a later Archbishop of Canterbury, Theodore of Tarsus, actually argues for the opposite, that these Frankish purity codes maybe should be kept. And so what we see in the 7th century is actually debate about application and contextualization, and that sometimes Christianity is having to adapt to earlier iterations of Christianity. So context is everything. Finally, you have another reading from another section of the ecclesiastical history that's in Populi and Stirk around whether or not pagan temples should be destroyed. And Gregory gives the advice based on his Roman experience of temples being converted into churches. And this is instructions he gives to the abbot Mellitus in the year 601. And he says, convert the temples, don't destroy them. These buildings can be useful. Use these sites to show people the error of their ways and to help lead them to conversion. He says in a similar way, if people are accustomed to coming to a sacred grove annually to worship their gods, just turn it into another kind of Christianized celebration. If they want to sacrifice their oxen, instead turn it into a feast in honor of a saint or of a dedication of a church or some other kind of Christian practice. And so what you see then is a process of Christianizing Anglo-Saxon culture. And this confidence that Gregory has that culture can lead or aid in the process of conversion. This is going to be a continued dynamic throughout the history of Christianity, and is one that's worth our reflecting on here and in our class discussions. Okay, that's enough for now. I look forward to talking to you next time about the emergence of what we call Carolingian Christianity, or Christianity in the time of the reign of Charlemagne.